The Australian share market pushes beyond 8,000 points for the first time. Australian banks are forced to refund vulnerable customers, and US President Joe Biden calls for a cooling of the political temperature as Donald Trump heads to the Republican Party convention. Welcome to Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. It's Tuesday, the 16th of July, 2024. I'm Julian King, filling in for Michael Thompson this week. And good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Julian. Day two, you enjoying it?
Sean, second day in, enjoying it immensely, but I tell you, when Michael returns, he can have his mornings back.
Yeah, it's the early mornings that'll get you.
Okay, so the main story this morning, Sean, the Australian share market has pushed through 8,000 points for the first time, spurred on by gains on Wall Street on the back of hopes that interest rates will start falling in coming months.
It's taken 3 years to go from 7,000 points to 8,000 points, though in October last year the bourse was as low as 6,800 points. Since then, it's up more than 18%. The fast rise over the past 7 or 8 months, but really over the past 3 years, has mostly been fueled by low interest rates post-COVID. Now, in more recent times, I suppose the run reflects more about interest rate expectations rather than actual falling interest rates. So they haven't fallen yet, but people think they will, and that certainly put a spark under the equity market. The sector powering the moves more than any other, at least locally, is definitely the financials, and particularly the big four banks. Commonwealth Bank's had a record high. National Australia Bank was last at these levels back in 2007. ANZ's around a 7-year high. Westpac's at a 5-year high. Industrial property giant Goodman has been a standout over the past 3 years, particularly since the beginning of last year. The tech stocks also did well over the past 3 years, but they're actually only 3% of the ASX 200. So when they move, it doesn't actually push the market that much, unlike the banks. The materials index, which includes the big miners, well, they've detracted from the index over the last year. Generally, the large caps and the mega caps have done much better than the smaller caps, not just over the last year, but over the past 3 years. Anyway, yesterday, finally, we pushed past that 8,000 point barrier.
Okay, so the bourse has pushed past 8,000 points. So what next? Does it keep rising?
Julian, that's a question well beyond me. The optimists, like Beta Shares chief economist David Bassanese, says the local market is relatively cheap and unloved and may benefit if investors start shifting out of US large cap tech stocks. AMP head of investment strategy Shane Oliver forecasts the ASX 200 will reach 8,100 points by year end, dragged along by rising share markets overseas. Mind you, he didn't think it would be this high this quickly, so he has upped his forecast. Now, the upcoming earnings season, which kicks off in a little over a fortnight, could well make or break many of the companies on the market. There's plenty of risks around, not least an overvalued US share market. If Wall Street tumbles, so too will the local market. There's also plenty of geopolitical risk from Europe to the Middle East to Asia and the US, as well as fears of a recession. So the short answer, Julian, is I don't know whether it'll go up or down, but certainly if you are going to invest, we always recommend speaking to a financial advisor.
Okay, so that's what's happened over the past 3 years. What were the stocks yesterday, Sean, that pushed the bourse over that 8,000 point mark?
So during yesterday's session, the market, as I said, was up 0.7%. It closed at 8,017.6 points, 817.6 points. Its all-time high reached yesterday morning. It was 8,037.3 points, 8,037.3 points. Now, yesterday, it was interest rate-sensitive technology stocks that did best. WiseTech Global, REA, and Xero all jumped. Higher iron ore prices helped push up the big miners, including BHP and Fortescue Metals. Wesfarmers, Woodside Energy, Aristocrat Leisure, QBE, Cochlear, they also did pretty well. Plenty of corporate news around. Lifestyle Communities shares fell 18% following a news report from the ABC that featured residents accusing the company of immoral and unethical conduct. Aussie Broadband's shares slumped 14% after it lowered its earnings guidance for this financial year. The telco said it will aggressively pursue customers at its larger rivals, including Telstra and Optus, with a new brand. It's called Buddy Telco. Apparently that offers, Aussie Broadband reckons it will offer significantly cheaper broadband services, though investors aren't so sure, hence the sell-off yesterday. And Star Entertainment's share price dropped 2% after it said it's going to have to shut down its electronic gaming machines and table games this weekend because of some type of systems problem. Not quite clear how long those games will be offline.
No. Okay, what's happening in international markets?
Well, global markets reacted as anticipated following the Donald Trump shooting, with Bitcoin rising, the US dollar edging higher and bond yields rising. Now, the reason bond yields go up If Trump wins the presidency, people expect interest rates will stay higher for longer. And that's what bond yields are reflecting, expectations on interest rates. Energy stocks are also expected to do better thanks to Donald Trump's apparent dislike of renewables. Now, of course, all of this is based on the idea that what happened on the weekend will help Mr. Trump's efforts to gain the White House. The unknown in all this is what the reaction to the weekend will trigger inside the US. If it leads to more violence, then traditional safe haven assets like gold, bonds, the US dollar should benefit. Away from that, in commodity markets, oil prices are flat. Gold's pushed above $2,400 an ounce, and iron ore is holding around $110 a ton. Bitcoin's trading around $63,000 a unit, while the Aussie dollar is buying 67.7 US cents.
And immediately after the show, stay listening for your chat, Sean, with Ed John from the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, where you touch upon the rather sexy issue of CEO pay.
We love CEO pay. ACSI, the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, every year put together what they call the realised pay. So it's actually the money people get each year. Now, the head of ResMed, a guy called Mick Farrell, he comes in at the top, almost $50 million. Robert Thompson from News Corp is number 2. And so the list goes on. We talked to him about how much they make, the fact that so much more of it, I mean, the actual sort of underlying wages haven't really risen, but bonuses have risen. And even, no matter how your company performs, you still seem to be getting a bonus. So we talked to Ed about all of that. Kind of voyeuristic, don't you reckon, Julian, those sorts of stories?
Very much so, especially if you're a shareholder and your company's not doing particularly well.
Yeah, we mentioned that too.
We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. And to the big story in world news, Sean, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said the attempted assassination of Donald Trump was a shock to the system and said it was a reminder that peaceful democratic processes in Australia can't be taken for granted.
Mr. Albanese said it's a great thing that in Australia, by and large, politicians, including the Prime Minister, can wander about events and can walk around safely. That's a good thing, and it's important that democracy be cherished, he said. Australia's former ambassador to the US, Arthur Sinodinos, said the shooting wasn't unexpected, telling AAP that he's surprised it's taken this long for something to happen. He said there's been a normalisation of very unusual behaviour in the US, and I quote him, given the amount of polarisation in the US, the amount of mudslinging that goes on, the attempts by each side to demonise the other, it's not surprising.
Yeah, now this is big news. Victorian Premier Jacinta Allan will ask the federal government to exercise its power under the Fair Work Act to potentially terminate all CFMEU enterprise bargaining agreements on Victorian construction sites.
The Premier said she'll look at how to toughen anti-bikie laws in the state and how to make it more difficult for certain people to associate with each other. She slammed the state branch of the CFMEU for self-interested thuggery, as she put it, and said the rotten culture must be pulled out by the roots. Her comments came after the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, flagged more action against the union after the Victorian division was placed into administration yesterday. He said all options are now on the table to deal with the renegade organisation. A 9-media investigation over the weekend found that underworld figures had infiltrated major Victorian and New South Wales construction projects. The investigation prompted the resignation of union boss John Sepka on Friday. More stories are flowing from it. It really is the dismantling of the CFMEU at the moment.
Yeah, you feel like there's a lot more to emerge from this story, don't you?
Yeah.
Now, several Australian banks will be forced to refund more than $28 million to 136,000 vulnerable customers after an investigation by the corporate COP found systemic high fee charging.
ANZ, Commonwealth Bank, Westpac and Bendigo and Adelaide Bank have agreed to move 200,000 customers into low-fee accounts also. That'll cost them about $10.7 million in fees annually, according to a report in the Financial Review. The banks will also write to a further 2 million customers to advise them of low-fee alternatives as part of actions agreed with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. Now, the investigation comes 6 years after the Hayne Banking Royal Commission, in which banks faced fierce criticism for their conduct, including similar instances of charging vulnerable people higher fees. What we heard yesterday just seems to have echoes of what we heard during that Hayne Banking Royal Commission. Let's hope, I'm sure we won't, but let's hope we don't go back there.
Yeah, the banks know how to lose a PR battle, don't they, Sean?
They sure do.
Okay, real estate agents, lawyers and accountants will be brought under strict new reporting requirements as part of an overhaul of Australia's money laundering and counter-terrorism finance legislation.
The goal is to clamp down on the flow of proceeds of crime into Australia, according to Attorney General Mark Dreyfus. Mr. Dreyfus said the mooted reforms are required as Australia faces a serious risk of exploitation by criminals seeking to launder illicit funds. He said globally, trillions of dollars are generated from illegal activities such as drug trafficking, tax evasion, people smuggling, cybercrime and arms trafficking. And according to The Australian, he went on to say that some of that is used to fund further serious crimes such as terrorism, child abuse and human trafficking. Mr. Dreyfus said the regulatory overhaul will capture more entities to prevent abuse in the financial system, while also simplifying the reporting regime faced by businesses captured by the reforms.
Now, we said the banks know how to lose a PR battle. I think the same thing might be said for airlines.
Yes.
Sean, the top complaints against airlines last year were about requests for refunds and the big one, flight delays. Together, they made up almost 3/4 of all complaints.
Yeah, so the industry-funded Airline Customer Advocate said customers took 10% more flights domestically and internationally last year, with total passenger numbers reaching about 67.6 million. The Advocate received 1,408 eligible complaints last year, which is up about 9%. It may not sound like many, but it only gets to the Airline Customer Advocate when it's been through all the other processes as well. It's been through the airlines themselves. So 1,400 serious complaints, think of it that way, 9% increase. It's kind of in line with the passenger numbers jump, but it's still a fair few complaints. The overall complaint resolution rate for 2023 declined from the prior year, and the complaint finalisation time frame averaged about 37 calendar days. That's across the whole year. For the second half of the year, it was only 19 days, which is actually within the agreed service level of 20 days. The airlines themselves saying it's not a bad outcome. I'm not so sure about that, Julian.
They would say that, wouldn't they?
They would.
In international news, US President Joe Biden has called for calm and efforts to lower the temperature in the wake of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump over the weekend.
In a televised speech from the White House, which in itself is unusual, Mr. Biden said, I quote, "While we disagree, we are not enemies. We're neighbours. We are friends, co-workers, citizens, and most importantly, we are fellow Americans," end quote. Mr. Biden said he had spoken to Mr. Trump and he's grateful he's going well. Dare I say, Julian, Joe Biden almost looked presidential yesterday, something he hasn't done for a while. Meanwhile, the FBI said the investigation so far suggests that the shooter acted alone, also that another device, which media is reporting as a bomb, was found in the shooter's car. Now, there's been background on the man killed in the crowd. His name was Corey Comparator. He's a firefighter, a churchgoer apparently, and an avid supporter of Mr. Trump. When the firing began, he threw himself over his family members to shield them. He was hit in the head and died at the scene. Very, very sad. For his part, Donald Trump said he wouldn't let a potential assassin force him to change his schedule. He was in Milwaukee for the Republican National Convention opening overnight. He told US tabloid The New Post that the doctor at the hospital he visited called it a miracle what happened, and presumably meaning a miracle that nothing worse happened.
Now, Sean, China's economy grew at its slowest pace in 5 quarters as efforts to boost consumer spending fell short, piling pressure on Beijing to lift confidence at a twice-a-decade policy meeting this week.
Yeah, very important for Australia, this one. Gross domestic product in China expanded 4.7% in the second quarter compared to a year earlier. That was well below what people expected. Retail sales rose at the slowest pace since 2022, basically showing a flurry of government efforts to boost confidence have done little. The National Bureau of Statistics said the growth slowdown in the second quarter was due to short-term factors such as extreme weather and rain and floods, that type of thing, but also insufficient domestic demand and clogged domestic circulation. This all came just ahead of President Xi Jinping opening the third plenum meeting this week. Now, the idea of the third plenum is that it sets major economic and political policies for coming years. Slowdown in the economy is a poor backdrop to start that plenum.
This is interesting. The rental car sector is dumping electric vehicles in the US, with novice drivers finding them hard to charge but also difficult to control.
It's almost funny. So, it's not. Electric vehicles have been a bit of a financial disaster for rental companies, notably Hertz, which has pulled back on plans to buy 100,000 Teslas after the car's resale values plunged. The fact that their resale value has plunged has turned a lot of rental companies off them because, of course, after a certain number of kilometres, they tend to sell those former rental cars. Last year, more than 4% of cars sold to rental companies were EVs. This year, it's just 1.4%, according to a report in the New York Times. Most rental car complexes at airports lack chargers. Problem number one. Making money renting EVs is harder than forecast. Problem number two. Problem number three. Many renters aren't prepared for how quickly electric cars accelerate, leading to more accidents and higher insurance premiums. And number four, some companies found they just can't get spare parts for EVs as quickly as they could for gasoline cars. Julian, I think the love affair with EVs is waning somewhat.
Yeah, just wait till petrol prices go up even more, though.
True.
Clearly somebody complaining about finding them difficult to control, Sean. I've never had to reverse park a car without power steering.
Ah, yeah, no power steering and a manual.
You can drive a manual car, can't you, Sean?
I grew up in the country, Julian. Of course I can drive one.
You can take the boy out of country. Cannot take the country out of the boy.
That's right.
Okay, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Ed John from the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors.
All about CEO pay, who's earning most and whether they're worth it, Julian.
That is up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much, Julian.
It's Tuesday, the 16th of July, 2024. Make sure you're following the podcast. Join us on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, TikTok and Facebook. Have a great day.